G'day, welcome to Pace Reptiles. Today we're basically just going to be going over blue tongue care. Doing a little bit of an enclosure. They're pretty basic species, so there's not too much you really need to know to keep one of these animals. But we'll basically be building an enclosure for them. At the moment, we've actually had to change what I'd usually use for their substrate, which is a nice sort of a thick dirt, if you will, that you can actually collect from their natural habitat. If you go to certain locations, you're able to do that. Properties, sides of roads, things like that, rather than going into like a national park, for example. That's a big no-no. You can't do that. And so you're able to get natural resources that would have in the wild and bring that back from going to properties and people that you know and getting it that way, rather than what we're going to have to be doing right now. We're actually going to be using a type of kitty litter. This type of kitty litter, it's a well-known substrate in the reptile community for being good for snakes. Usually it's used and kept with snakes, but today we're going to test it out with blue tongues. I mean, there's not too much difference between keeping a snake on it than keeping a blue tongue on it, because it's a terrestrial species. They need a nice flat open area, and then you can put different objects in their environment to obviously liven up that, change their environment to give them enrichment. And that's what we're going to be doing today for our little Eastern blue tongue. Okie dokie, so here's the enclosure. There's plenty of space, which is probably the most important thing with a grow out enclosure. It's sort of their end and final enclosure. They're going to start out a little bit smaller, and then they're going to get large enough to where they'll fill and occupy and use all of that space. And it's just a little bit larger for them when they're smaller. One of these little Eastern blue tongue lizards, because it's a terrestrial species, it means that the species is going to be on the floor the majority of the time, which means that you're not going to be putting, branches in there. You're not going to be building height in the enclosure. You need lots of things that they can get over, climb, and create enrichment with, but it makes it easy enough for them to move around on the floor level, rather than them, perching like a bearded dragon would or a water dragon would near the water. These guys are going to be sort of hiding out under leaf litter, getting into their hides, cracks, nooks, and crannies, and that's where they're going to spend most of their time. And then when they go out and hunt, they're going to go and prowl around sort of the floor area of the bush, which is what's quite common with these fellas. And so we're going to create a environment for this little Eastern blue tongue, which is indicative of what it will have in the wild. Okay, so the substrate that we're going to be using in this enclosure is going to be a cat litter based product. So it's sort of mushed up paper into little pellets, and you can put it in there. It's really good for pythons. A lot of reptile breeders that breed pythons, they use this, but we're actually going to be using it for one of the blue tongues today. And we've got another blue tongue enclosure which we're going to do the same for. Now, in this enclosure, you're probably going to want maybe about an inch in depth. They're not really a digging species. I mean, they can dig, they do burrow with it, but the substrate that we're putting in there is probably going to be something that they're not really going to dig in, more or less. They're probably going to just use their hides and the bits of enrichment that you put in there with this substrate. And so we'll do like a time lapse or something, and you guys can check that out. Okie dokie. So we've got the cat litter in here. The important thing now is to fill the enclosure with things that are going to create enrichment and also visual barriers between you and the animal. Because this is an animal that I've already worked with, it's not afraid of people. I'm not too worried about putting too many visual barriers in there. More or less just things that create enrichment and things it can hide and move around on. And so what I want to do here is I want to have a nice central hide. It's going to be facing backwards. So once he's in it, he feels nice and secure. The other thing I want to be doing is I need a nice heat rock or tile. We actually have some really nice slate that we can put over here, and that'll create a nice natural effect. I say natural effect, we're using cat litter here, but it'll create something in his enclosure which is nice enrichment. And then obviously some plants in here, so it looks nice and clean, and so it looks nice, and it's also pleasant to look at because this is a piece in the house. People walk by this all the time. You want it to look nice, more or less, so that it's almost like an art piece, if you will, a living art piece, having an enclosure in here. Something like you'd have a fish tank. You have a fish tank in there, it looks very nice. Same thing you do with your reptile enclosures, or at least that's what we're doing here. We've got bearded dragons on the top and bottom and a blue tongue in the center. Beautiful. So this is the hide we're going to be using. This is probably one of your normal casual Exo Terra hides. I believe it's an Exo Terra, but they're just normal reptile hides you can buy anywhere. You can even make them out of rock, just hollow it out. You could glue some rocks together and put them together that way. I've known people that have done it that way. Nice big bits of slate that he can rest on, that will also hold the ambient heat in there. Now, if you were doing this with a species that would be able to lift this up or burrow under it, if it was a smaller species, like maybe it was a juvenile Aki, we have one of those here. You make sure that they're seated, the rocks are seated right down on the ground, so we can't push around, remove substrate from the bottom, and then it could possibly collapse on the animal. But with the size of the blue tongue and the animal in which it is, I would be very, very surprised if he could actually do that in this enclosure and setup. Okie dokie, so for plants, basically we're just going to be putting the plants that he used to have in his old enclosure back into this one. They've been in there for a very small amount of time, so enrichment is still there, and we'll kind of just sit them in under the rock so you can't see the end of the plant. There we go. Perfect. Cool. So that's in there now. He's got lots of space to wander around, and I'm sure once we're done, there'll be a nice thicket of bush. Probably at the back we'll put some fake plants in, which will just add that sort of nice pop of greenery that I'd like to see with the contrast of cages. Give that nice contrast. When you have a nice exhibit like this, having contrast in enclosures can also make it a little bit more pleasant to look at. Okie dokie, so these will probably be the plants we're actually going to be using. I'm going to hang this from the roof somewhere. Got mesh wire up in the top, so that'll allow me to hang things in there and remove them, which is really quite nice. You probably can see that better there. So I can hang branches from the top and remove them very easily because of the wire mesh that we've put in there. These bits here, I'm actually going to stick these probably in the back corner somewhere, and I'm going to have a rock to cover up the back piece there and kind of give it some height there. With enclosures, not only is if it's an aesthetic for you, it probably means that it's a nicer, more well-built habitat for your animal. So if you're happy and it looks very nice, I'm sure your animal will enjoy it as well. Okie dokie, with the enclosure completely finished, we'll pretty much just pop the blue tongue in, let him have a look around. The idea and the concept behind this is obviously you've got a nice warm spot over here which is heated by the basking light, a hide which is facing backwards, which means that the animal can get inside and it will feel nice and secure. The animal can't see you from inside the hide, which is a big plus. Lots of foliage and stuff that just kind of gives a visual barrier that he may want to get behind all of this foliage back here and behind the hide, behind the rock, and then obviously he has a nice opportunity to bask. With this animal, I'm not too worried about him having too many visual barriers, although there are plenty in here. The visual barriers are just something you might want to give to an animal that you first get. So maybe with a water dragon, it's very important to have visual barriers when you first get that, because of the flighty nature of the animal. A blue tongue is quite a slow moving animal. They can move quite quickly, but they're not typically going to be using things that are on the roof like this. That's more of an aesthetic thing, an enrichment thing as well, because it just creates something that he can look at, stimulates his brain, as well as all of the stuff that's on the floor. With temperatures, you're probably going to want to keep these guys around probably 29 degrees is a good basking spot. 29 to 27 would be a good basking spot. Eastern blue tongues can go down right into the 15s in the wild. There are temperatures outside at the moment, they're about 15 on cold rocks, but you probably want to keep them around 20. 20 would be the cool side, and then about 29 the hot side. That way they get a nice variation of temperatures, and they're able to use them the way they would in the wild. They get too hot on this side, move over to this side. They get too cold on this side, they come over to this side, and they're able to heat themselves up nicely. Awesome. Let's pop them in. Awesome. So now is the fun bit, popping your little animal into his new enclosure and seeing whether he likes it or not. Now, I have no doubt that he's going to enjoy his enclosure that we've built today. It's awesome just seeing them act naturally. Or as one of the fellas over in England, New England Reptiles, he has a lot of monitors over there, but one thing that really resonated with me that he said was seeing them in their thinking state rather than in a defensive or a food mode. So that they're acting the way they would naturally in their environment without hesitation of people, fear of food, fear of being prey, or or in that food state where their focus is just solely on food, which is really quite nice. And you see that with all the bearded dragons and skinks when they're kept properly. They just move around and frolic, if you will, in their enclosure. Awesome. And the last thing that we add to the enclosure is the water. And we're going to add that into the cold side of the enclosure so that obviously the humidity doesn't increase too much. As we are in Sydney, which is the natural environment for an eastern blue tongue, there's not really much that we need to do to the air. The humidity that's already here is already pretty okay for them. And so obviously just adding a little bit of water into the cooler side so he can drink, and it's a nice shallow bowl, and it's something that he's not going to be able to tip over very easily, so that he's able to drink water and keep his so he's able to drink water and keep his enclosure nice and clean. Okie dokie, guys, that was it for the enclosure build. We've got a good old Butch here enjoying his new basking spot. I hope you guys really enjoyed it, found something useful in the video. Please remember to like and subscribe, click that bell notification if you want to be notified for any more videos coming out, and we'll see you on the next adventure. See you later.